Michael Kroger, thank you for your time and Happy New Year to you too.
And to you, Chris.
I want to start with the news that's come out of Tasmania this afternoon. Will Hodgman, he would have to be probably the first politician to pull the plug as a premier in the first 2 weeks of the year.
Probably, and he's gone out on top, and he's done a magnificent job. He comes from a great Liberal family, of course. The late great Michael Hodgman was a distinguished minister in the Fraser government in his halcyon days. But yeah, a shock to everybody, a great disappointment. But he's given enormous service to the party, and as he said, it's time for his wife and kids, and I think we all understand that. So a great career, and we pay tribute to him. Yeah,
and it's not just 6 years that he was premier. He's been in the, as an MP, he's been there in the system for 16 years. It's a long time for kids in particular to handle your dad not being home.
Well, that's one of the things that people don't realise about politicians. I remember Michael Ronaldson, the former member for Ballarat, I think between 1980 and 1990, he was in a marginal federal seat, and he said he didn't see his kids almost for a decade. He'd go to 15 to 20 community functions from Friday night to Sunday night in his marginal seat, and basically didn't see his kids for a decade. And I'm sure that's repeated across this country. So, as much as politicians get a good bagging, they do work very, very long hours, and the families and the kids are the ones who miss out, Chris, and it's always been thus, unfortunately.
Yep, very true. Now, Victoria has pressed the button on a review into these bushfires, a $2.5 million review. There was some coverage of it this afternoon suggesting that, Premier Dan has beaten the PM.
Yeah, look, that's nonsense to suggest he's trying to one-up or get ahead of Scott Morrison. All the premiers, Liberal or Labor, and the Prime Minister have worked very closely during these last few months, and certainly Andrews has with Scott Morrison. And as you say, I think every state will do a review, as they should, quite frankly. How did they go locally in dealing with these fires? You're not going to go through the trauma we've been through without domestic state reviews of how the state authorities operated during these, really difficult times. And so, absolutely nothing wrong with the state doing that. And no suggestion that anyone's trying to one-up anybody, quite frankly.
This is your first appearance on Sky News since, of course, the worst of the bushfires took place. What was your reading of the way the Prime Minister was treated through this? I called it a pylon. I thought that half of it was totally unnecessary and unfair.
Well, to be frank, I think the attack on Scott Morrison's been absolutely appalling. This is almost he did so well with the media and won the election and all that, and so, it was time for him to cop some, adverse criticism. But what did he actually do? Well, he was away on a family holiday. He came back, because he was away when it happened, somehow this shows a man that lacks empathy. I mean, Chris, there's no politician in modern times who showed more empathy with Australians when they've been in trouble. Look at the national, the Drought and Flood National Recovery Agency in Queensland, led by Shane Stone. The extraordinary work they're doing, that's all led by Morrison. When Australians had great trouble with drought and flood, especially in North Queensland, Morrison was there with a massive chequebook and a huge recovery program, and that's exactly what he's doing now. But because he was away when it started, and people say, well, he shouldn't have gone away, and Scott's admitted, okay, maybe he shouldn't have done that at the time. But, okay, we all make those mistakes, but the pylon, as you say, has been extreme, unfounded, and then, of course, you get all this Twitter abuse from all these mad Greens who only want to talk about one thing. So, yeah, I think it's been a very, very profoundly disappointing response by certain aspects, certain elements of the media and some members of the public, to a Prime Minister who shows great empathy in times of crisis.
What's your reading of this personal category within Newspoll that he fell down? I think it's the preferred Prime Minister, went down by 8. Is that just a one-off? Can he rebuild that? And I guess in some ways, as long as you're in striking distance in two-party preferred, who cares about the other measurements?
Well, of course, look, it's very early in the cycle. Yes, this is a response to the massive media attack on Scott Morrison. It's almost directly attributable to that. And Labor's increase in standing is because if we go down, they go up. And Labor have got a run-dead strategy at the minute where it's basically, saying to as little as possible, don't scare the horses, don't have a big agenda like Corbyn and Shorten had, And I think that's what you'll find between now and the next election. So, yeah, I think it's in terms of Scott Morrison, his standing will recover because he's actually an exceptional Prime Minister, quite frankly.
Yeah. He's talking about evolving carbon emissions. He's not talking about evolving targets. I get the feeling that he won't be giving the Extinction Rebellion people what they want, which is a doubling of the target by 2030.
No, he certainly won't be doing that. And quite frankly, as James Morrow wrote a very good article today, basically saying if people want to demonstrate about global warming, why aren't they demonstrating in Canberra outside the Chinese embassy or outside Chinese consulate?
Correct.
The Chinese emissions are going to increase, I think, 130% between 2020 and 2030. A massive, massive increase in emissions. If you want to know where the problem is, it's in China, with the huge number of coal-fired power stations they're building there. If people think that's a problem, that's where the emissions increase are taking place. Why you'd be attacking a government in Australia which is actually cutting emissions, God only knows. Well, we actually know why. This is part of a broader political agenda, Chris, that we all know what's going on.
Well, the whole stupidity of that is the fact that before he went off to Hawaii, he was on the Queensland fire front and the northern New South Wales fire front. Straight after those bushfires, he was already doing what they were saying he walked away from.
Well, that's exactly right. Scott Morrison knows what every federal leader knows, which is, despite the fact that bushfires in particular are always seen as a state issue, there's a role for the national leader. And as I said, I think the criticism he suffered was way over the top. And I think a lot of people were shocked by the level of vitriol directed against a man who, as I said in previous times of crisis, just months ago, was the first person there to show empathy. So, as I said, I think this is just part of the left's broader attack on Scott Morrison because he's, otherwise done a pretty unimpeachable job as leader of this country and led the coalition to a great victory, saved Australia from massive tax increases under the previous Labor government. So you can see a few people, trying to get a bit square with him. And some, as I said, some of the media commentary has been quite extreme and very personal and very vitriolic and extremely unnecessary at a time of great national concern, Chris.